Welcome to Lesson 7 of Section 5 of the BJCP Tasting Exam Preparation Program by the Brewers Anonymous Homebrew Club. In this lesson, we are going to fill out our overall impression section of our score sheet. But before we get started, let's get through our usual disclaimer. This episode in the series is not affiliated with, nor endorsed or checked by the BJCP, the AHA, or any other organizations discussed in any episodes of this series. All right. Overall impression. In this lesson, we are going to write our overall impression for the beer that we've been judging virtually or maybe imaginarily, which is, I believe, not a word throughout this section. And then we're also going to check our feedback. Make sure we have everything checked off that we just discussed in Section 6 on our score sheet, because like I explained in that lesson, feedback is not limited to overall impressions. So let's get started. Let's take a look at our score sheet, remind ourselves what we wrote. Here is our aroma, appearance, flavor, mouthfeel. In fact, let's go ahead and read it because we're going to refer back to it a couple times here. So for aroma, we have prominent punchy aroma of grapefruit zest and sappy pine needle dominates. Subtle, low, grainy, sweet malt provides a crackery-like backdrop. Pristine fermentation profile with no yeast esters or sulfur. No DMS or diacetyl notes. For appearance, we wrote polished deep gold with brilliant clarity. Head has fallen to a thick color of small to fine bubbles around the glass with a nearly full covering of fine bubbles across the top of the beer. Small steady carbonation bubbles visible. On flavor, we noted bold, assertive grapefruit peel and resinous pine hop flavors lead the palate. Medium, high, firm bitterness on the tongue that provides a sharp, dry finish into a slightly harsh aftertaste. Low, grainy, sweet malt provided the necessary structure but doesn't compete. And finally, for mouthfeel, we noted medium light body with moderate creamy carbonation. Carbonation adds a welcome carbonic bite. Beer has a smooth, crisp texture that finishes dry and slightly astringent from the hop load. All right. With all that in front of us, which will be in front of us on our exam, we need to write our overall impression. So let's start with this. A bright hop-forward beer that showcases classic grapefruit and pine character with a very clean fermentation profile. The malt provides just enough support without distracting from the hops. Maybe a little too hop-forward for style. Consider a low alpha acid hop or less hops in the late addition boils, whirlpool, or dry hop. Slightly softening the bitterness by adjusting the bitter hop selection, amount, or boil time to smooth the finish could make the beer more refined. Now, we have our complete score sheet, and we know what the competencies are that we're going to be graded on in feedback. So let's take a look at this quick checklist and see if we've covered everything best we can. Now, we're going to start off by checking a few of these off as already done because we've discussed how to do these in other sections. We didn't cover them directly in this section, and namely the score competencies. We've discussed those already. It's not the focus of this section, so we're going to check those off. In this scenario, they're complete, and we're confident that it's consistent with our feedback. So where we're really going to start here is with the constructive, polite, and professional feedback. And I think we can safely check that off without further review. We didn't use any slang. We certainly didn't hurl any insults. And there was no generalization, or at least there isn't to the best of our ability. And we are, in the end, trying to do our best in this. So we'll go ahead and check that one off. The next two, the attempts to provide accurate diagnosis of stylistic and technical flaws. The stylistic flaws, I'm confident enough to check off, so let's check that off. Now let's go back to the overall impression to check on the technical flaw feedback we gave. Here's my attempt at the technical feedback. It mentions both the recipe and process adjustments. Now, does this address the technical to an extent? Now, this does address the technical to an extent, but is it what we need for our best possible feedback? Hold on to that thought for a second. Let's go back to the checklist and add something else to look for here. Let's look at the next two lines. Feedback given is accurate to the characteristics perceived by the judge, and feedback in the overall impression section is consistent with the score sheet comments. All right, I mentioned those two things for a reason. Let's go back to our initial overall impression. This is the first time I ever mentioned that the hops were too much for style. So I have to ask myself here, did I really think that, or did I write that because it's something I thought examinees might also say? Considering that I never mentioned this in the past 10 to 12 minutes that I've been filling out this score sheet for this beer, I'm probably overthinking it here subconsciously and trying to maybe game the system a little bit by throwing everything that could possibly be wrong with this beer and hoping something sticks to give me more points. It's really not a good plan, honestly. Also, what about the stronger than expected bitterness and astringent characters that I did mention? There's no mention of those in here, and they should be addressed. So let's try to fix this. We're going to rewrite this portion right here to now read, the main opportunity for improvement is in the finish. The firm bitterness is slightly harsh and a touch astringent, which carries into the aftertaste. And that actually makes this final part of the feedback, the technical feedback, the slightly softening the bitterness by adjusting the bitter hop selection, amount, or boil time to smooth out the finish can make this beer more refined, actually fit the entire overall impression of this beer better in terms of what I've written in the score sheet, and hopefully going to help me when it comes time to be graded. So let's go back to our checklist. We can now check off a few of these. We had our attempt to provide an accurate diagnosis of technical flaws. Feedback given is accurate to the characteristics received by the judge. And then we jump down to feedback and overall impression section is consistent with these score sheet comments. Now, I want to talk about this. Feedback does not make any assumptions about the process or ingredients. So I write, slightly softening the bitterness by adjusting the bitter hop selection amount or boil time to smooth out the finish would make the beer more refined. How far into the weeds do we need to get with this? This does make an assumption that we're using hops. It also makes an assumption that we're adding them to a lengthy boil time. We're also assuming that they boil. I think this is something, I don't know that this really needs to be addressed, but I did want to point out to not overthink this to an extent. We're going to have to apply some knowledge to not only the brewing process, but to the style in order to give our feedback, or else there's really nothing else we can say. In doing that, I don't think we're crossing the line into assumptions. Now, saying something like don't use mosaic hops for bittering is an assumption. I think what we've written here is not an assumption. I think that it's well known, and I think it can be pointed out that hops are used for beer, and boiling is usually a component. Now, of course, there are some styles that are not boil, but we're, like I said, how far into the weeds do you want to get to this? So I think you can overthink this to an extent, but also applying knowledge into what you're saying without being too specific of what type of hops, measurements, and times, I think that is not crossing any line. Again, don't know if that needs to be pointed out, but since it was worded the way it was worded, I thought I'd take the time to just kind of share my opinion. Keep in mind, I'm not a grader. I don't have any idea, but you're going to have to apply some knowledge of how beer is made and what it's made from in order to get the rest of your feedback points correct, or maximized is a better way to say that. So I think on that note, we can say that feedback does not make any assumptions about the process or ingredients. Now, finally, observations are in the appropriate section. Let's take a look. Just real quick, not going to read these again. Just kind of scan over that. I don't see anything that says something about that main category title that is out of place, so we're going to check that one off too. Now, obviously, I think this is obvious. You're not going to have this checklist during the exam. And I certainly do not suggest you make one on an exam day. More, I want you to just be aware of these and keep them somewhere in the recesses of your mind when you're reviewing your score sheet before you go into the next beer or before you turn over your final paper. The need for this checklist is actually going to be a lot less when you have the score sheet in front of you and can see everything in one glance. So let's take a look at what we're going to actually see come test day. So you can probably see having everything right in front of you makes this review a lot easier, and it makes it easier to make sure that all the feedback we need is represented the best that we can do. Again, we're trying to do our best, and doing that is really just the best course of action at this point. We can also make sure that our score sheet is complete. And we'll want to make sure that our upper right-hand corner is filled out. All of our feedback is filled out. If we perceived any off flavors, in this case, it was a low astringency. I marked it off and I marked low. And our scores are filled out. We double-checked our math. That's it, right? There's a pop quiz. There's something missing on the score sheet. The score sheet is not complete. You see what it is? I'll give you 3 seconds. All right, I think that was 3 seconds in that pause. Anyway, this bottom, here's, I'm going to move my mouse over, this bottom right-hand corner box, the style, technical, intangibles matrix, the thing that is the most commonly missed, not only in the exam, from what I understand, but I do know for a fact when paper score sheets were used for competitions, the most commonly missed thing. So that's why I kind of made this little production hammer that home. Don't forget this part, because then you're leaving completeness points on the table. And on that note, that is it for this lesson. It's also it for this section. We'll head on to the next section for the next set of videos. So until we meet again there, I'll say thank you for watching, and I'll see you in that next section.